In April 1980, thousands of Zimbabweans flooded the streets in celebration. After nearly a century of colonial domination and years of brutal guerrilla warfare, white minority rule in Rhodesia had finally come to an end. The new nation of Zimbabwe had been born. Crowds danced in the streets and liberation fighters waved their rifles in the air. Across Africa, the victory was celebrated as proof that colonial rule could be defeated. And standing at the center of it all was a quiet, highly educated former school teacher named Robert Mugabe. At the time, Mugabe did not look like the stereotypical revolutionary strongman. He spoke softly and carried himself more like a university lecturer than a guerrilla commander. But behind that calm exterior was a man who had spent years helping lead one of Africa's most significant liberation struggles.
We want full and unfettered democracy. Down with the racist constitution, down with the dirty elections.
To many Africans, Mugabe became a hero. A man who had defeated white minority rule. A man who promised reconciliation, education, land reform, and African dignity. But decades later, Zimbabwe would become known for something very different. Political violence, election rigging, economic collapse, and one of the most controversial massacres in modern African history. So, how did Robert Mugabe go from liberation hero to one of Africa's most divisive leaders? And more importantly, did the man who liberated Zimbabwe eventually destroy it? Robert Gabriel Mugabe was born in 1924 at Kutama Mission, northwest of Salisbury, which is now Harare. Unlike many future revolutionaries, Mugabe's early life was not especially dramatic. He was known to be serious, introverted, and deeply academic. Catholic missionaries played a major role in his education, and from an early age, Mugabe became obsessed with learning. Over time, he earned multiple degrees through correspondence programs while teaching in southern Rhodesia, northern Rhodesia, and later in Ghana. And Ghana would definitely change him. While he was there, Mugabe encountered the growing wave of African nationalism sweeping across the continent under leaders like Kwame Nkrumah. Across Africa, colonial empires were collapsing. New nations were emerging, and increasingly, liberation movements embraced socialism, anti-imperialism, and armed struggle. When Mugabe returned to Rhodesia, he entered politics fully. But African nationalism in Rhodesia was divided. One major movement was ZAPU, which was led by Joshua Nkomo. Another movement, known as ZANU, would eventually fall under Mugabe's leadership. The split between the two groups was political, ideological, and increasingly ethnic, with ZANU drawing much of its support from Shona-speaking populations, while ZAPU drew strong support from the Ndebele-speaking regions. At the time, these divisions seemed manageable, but in reality, they would later become catastrophic. In 1964, Mugabe was arrested by the Rhodesian government and imprisoned for over a decade. But prison did not weaken him, it elevated him. While incarcerated, Mugabe studied obsessively. He completed additional degrees through correspondence courses and developed a reputation for discipline and intellectual rigor. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Rhodesia descended deeper into war. By the 1970s, Rhodesia was engulfed in a brutal guerrilla conflict. ZANU's military wing, ZANLA, operated largely from Mozambique, and ZAPU's military wing, ZIPRA, operated from Zambia. The war became increasingly violent. Guerrilla groups attacked military targets, farms, and infrastructure, and villages were caught in the middle. And looming over all of this was the Cold War. China and the Soviet Union backed different liberation factions, and Western powers worried about communist influence in Southern Africa. Meanwhile, neighboring countries like Mozambique became vital launching pads for guerrilla operations. By the late 1970s, Rhodesia's position was becoming unsustainable. Sanctions had weakened the economy. The war was draining manpower, and international isolation was growing. Even South Africa, Rhodesia's most important regional ally, began signaling that white minority rule could not survive forever. Eventually, negotiations were held in London at Lancaster House, and in 1980, Zimbabwe officially became independent. For millions of black Zimbabweans, it felt like history itself had shifted, and Robert Mugabe emerged as the face of that victory. The early years of Robert Mugabe's rule are often forgotten today. Mugabe surprised many observers by promoting reconciliation with the white minority rather than immediate revenge. In one famous speech, he urged white Zimbabweans to remain and help build the country. Western governments praised him, foreign aid flowed in, and Zimbabwe's economy initially performed relatively well. Education expanded dramatically, healthcare improved, and literacy rates also rose. By the late 1980s, Zimbabwe had one of the highest literacy rates in Africa. Internationally, Mugabe became celebrated as an educated African statesman, and for many Africans, he symbolized something important: a liberation leader who had defeated colonial rule without immediately plunging the country into chaos. But beneath the optimism, the foundations of authoritarianism were already forming. Mugabe increasingly viewed political opposition not as democratic competition, but as betrayal. And nowhere would that become clearer than in Matabeleland.
But as long as dissidents come from a particular area, we will send troops to that area.
In the early 1980s, tensions between ZANU and ZAPU escalated rapidly. Mugabe's government accused dissidents associated with ZAPU of destabilizing the country. In response, the government deployed the 5th Brigade, a special military unit trained by North Korean advisors, into Matabeleland. What followed became known as Gukurahundi. Officially, the operation targeted dissidents, but civilians quickly became the victims. Villages were raided, people were beaten, tortured, and executed. Human rights organizations estimate that thousands of civilians were killed, although the exact numbers remain disputed. And for many years, discussion of Gukurahundi remained heavily suppressed inside Zimbabwe. But Gukurahundi fundamentally changed Zimbabwe's political trajectory. It revealed something many supporters had not fully recognized before: that the liberation movement that had fought against repression was now capable of repression itself. Eventually, ZAPU was absorbed into a unity agreement with ZANU. Mugabe had effectively consolidated power, and Zimbabwe was drifting steadily toward one-party dominance.
And the concept of setting up a party merely to oppose and not to assist a government in being to govern on a national basis is repugnant to me.
Through the 1990s, Zimbabwe's economy began showing serious strain. Corruption grew, government spending expanded, and patronage networks deepened. But the most explosive issue was the land. At independence, much of Zimbabwe's best farmland still belonged to a relatively small number of white commercial farmers. For many black Zimbabweans, land reform was not simply economic policy, it was unfinished decolonization. And importantly, that grievance was real. Colonial land dispossession in Rhodesia had created profound inequalities that independence had not fully resolved. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Mugabe's government accelerated land seizures dramatically. White-owned farms were occupied. Violence accompanied some of those invasions, and agricultural production declined sharply in key sectors. Supporters framed the seizures as long overdue justice. Critics argued the process had become chaotic, politicized, and economically destructive. And increasingly, many redistributed farms ended up not in the hands of ordinary peasants, but in the hands of political elites connected to the ruling party. And at that very same time, Mugabe faced his most serious political challenge yet. The movement for democratic change, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, gained significant support. For the first time in years, Mugabe's power appeared vulnerable, and the government responded aggressively. Opposition supporters were intimidated, journalists were arrested, and political violence intensified around elections. Meanwhile, the economy spiraled downwards. Inflation exploded, businesses collapsed, and unemployment soared. Eventually, Zimbabwe entered one of the worst hyperinflation crises in modern history. Prices changed constantly, savings became worthless, and people carried stacks of banknotes just to buy basic goods. At one point, Zimbabwe printed $100 trillion notes. Meanwhile, across Southern Africa, millions of Zimbabweans migrated in search of work and stability to South Africa, Botswana, and even overseas. An entire generation scattered across the diaspora. By the 2010s, Robert Mugabe was no longer the sharp revolutionary figure who once electrified anti-colonial movements. He was aging visibly, but he still refused to step down. Inside the ruling party, fierce succession battles emerged, and increasingly attention turned towards his wife, Grace Mugabe.
Mark my step. Whether you want to twist
her growing political influence began to alarm sections of the military and the ruling elite. And then, in November 2017, everything changed. Military vehicles rolled into the capital, Harare.
Armoured vehicles are patrolling the streets of the Zimbabwean capital, Harare, this afternoon after the army declared overnight that it was taking control of the country.
But remarkably, the military avoided calling it a coup.
Wish to make it abundantly clear that this is not a military takeover of government.
Instead, it framed the intervention as targeting criminals surrounding the president. After nearly 4 decades in power, Robert Mugabe was forced to resign. Crowds celebrated in the streets, and in one of history's greatest ironies, the liberation movement that had once brought Mugabe to power ultimately removed him. Today, Robert Mugabe's legacy remains deeply contested. To supporters, he remains the man who liberated Zimbabwe from white minority rule and restored African political control. To the critics, he became the architect of repression, corruption, and economic ruin. And perhaps the reason Mugabe remains so controversial is because both versions contain some truth. He was not simply a liberation hero, nor was he simply a dictator. He was both. A brilliant nationalist leader who helped end colonial rule, and an authoritarian ruler who increasingly treated opposition as treason. A man who spoke passionately about justice while presiding over political violence. A leader who promised liberation and yet spent decades consolidating power around himself. And in the end, that may be the real tragedy of Zimbabwe. Because the same revolution that once inspired millions slowly became a system many Zimbabweans feared. And somewhere along the way, the men who liberated Zimbabwe became very instrumental in destroying it.
We have not asked for any inch of Europe or any square inch of that territory. So, Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe.